Welcome to Dear Mr. Potter. I solemnly swear that I am up to no good. I am Alistair Stevens, and in this week's session, we conclude our discussion of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire by taking a look at the 2005 movie adaptation directed by Mike Newell, written by Steve Kloves, who has, of course, scripted all of the Harry Potter movies except for Order of Phoenix. He is returning again for the fourth movie in the Harry Potter saga, and well, he's faced with probably his greatest challenge yet, or at least the greatest challenge that he will face until we get to Deathly Hallows 1 and 2, because adapting Goblet of Fire is not easy. J.K. Rowling has presented Steve Kloves with something of an overwhelming challenge, I dare say. We're going to discuss a little how well the adaptation works tonight and where the adaptation falls short, which performances are chef-kiss brilliant and which performances are infuriatingly poor, and there are some which are infuriatingly poor. This may be a slightly shorter than usual session of Dear Mr. Potter, just because we're going to gloss a story with which we're already at least pretty familiar and talk about the adaptation as a whole. Filming on Goblet began early in 2004. It actually began 6 months before the release of Prisoner of Azkaban, and principal photography with the main cast started right around the time of Prisoner of Azkaban's release in June of 2004. The movie was an immediate commercial success. It went on to gross almost $900 million worldwide. As of right now, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire is the 49th highest grossing movie of all time, though it is the lowest Harry Potter movie on that list, exceeding only Chamber of Secrets, which doesn't break the top 50 at all. It has a score of 7.7 on IMDb, compared to 7.6 for Philosopher's Stone, 7.4 for Chamber, and 7.9 for Azkaban. IMDb proving once again that it will use just the entire scale here for rating movies. I'm not sure that if I was giving these movies a numerical score, that I would have them all here in that same neighborhood. But still, IMDb does what IMDb will. It is an enormously complicated film. It is an enormously enchanting film. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago very casually that Goblet of Fire has some of the most interesting adaptational choices in the entire Harry Potter series. And having watched this movie now 4 times in the last week and a half, 4 times in the last 10 days or so, I will actually stand by that comment. I will stand by and say, yeah, Goblet of Fire is a provocative and ambitious, sometimes outright audacious piece of adaptation, but it is also horribly inconsistent. It is borderline incomprehensible. It is very easily distracted by spectacle. And that is going to cause it problems as it tries to move through what is already a fairly oblique and labyrinthine plot. With that said, let's get into it. Let me cancel the slide here so that you can all see me. There's really no need for you to be looking just at that slightly sarcastic and snarky title card. Calmly is, of course, the title for tonight's episode because, well, for reasons which will become apparent when we get to that sequence. So we begin our movie, we open on skulls and on Nagini, and we go straight into Harry's dream, just as we do in the book. The dream of the very unfortunate Frank Bryce and his fate, which also gives us the new arrangement of the Harry Potter theme, this time by Patrick Doyle, who took over for John Williams for the soundtrack for this movie, and turns in generally solid, if somewhat uninspired, and occasionally relatively insipid pieces of music. The score for Goblet of Fire is, I think, pretty hands down the weakest score for any of the movies, but it does manage in certain moments to elevate itself into something quite charming and oddly simultaneously baroque and playful and self-aware and also mythic. There's also a real sense of substance behind some of the arrangements that we get, particularly of the pre-existing Harry Potter music, most of which is just Hedwig's theme, of course. It is that famous Harry Potter theme. The movie plays out the opening sequence pretty faithfully to the book, save for the inclusion of Barty Crouch Jr., which is one of the smarter pieces of adaptation. The inclusion of Barty Crouch Jr. in the movie up until the reveal is actually pretty smart. When we are adapting books for movies, we are challenged first and foremost by the transition from the medium of prose to the medium of the screen, to the visual medium. And that is going to pose problems because the association between characters and actors is simply so much more profound than the association between characters and whatever you imagine that character to look like. And so often the placeholder name that exists in your subconscious. I'm sure that many of us, as we're reading this book, just kind of tag and flag characters by their names, by their given names in the prose, rather than fully investing our imagination and representing these characters, particularly when we're reading the works of an author like J.K. Rowling, who, compared to many of her contemporaries, and certainly compared to many of those authors who came along after her in this fantasy YA space, is actually pretty light on the character description. She doesn't generally do what many YA authors do and give us a page of really quite careful and almost painstaking description associated with every one of our primary characters. That's not really how J.K. Rowling writes, and that is infinitely to her credit, by the way. I often find those long passages of character description quite stultifying. I find it quite difficult to get through them. J.K. Rowling is very light on her feet when it comes to characterization, and will more often than not characterize characters through dialogue and through action rather than that painstaking description. But that means that oftentimes I am left with particularly minor characters in the Harry Potter canon with just a placeholder sense of who they are. Just a little box labeled Draco Malfoy or labeled Crabbe, labeled Goyle, rather than a full three-dimensional representation of what that character looks like living and breathing in my imagination, including Barty Crouch earlier in the proceedings for me. Works very well in that it introduces a character who is defined by his absence, who is conspicuously absent from the arc of the film, and also means that when we get to the reveal, the whole span of the movie tightens up really quite beautifully. It comes into pretty sharp focus when we get the reveal in a way that it doesn't in the book. In the book, we're left with a lot of exposition, both the kind of retroactive exposition of the pensive scenes, now that we have sufficient context for understanding exactly what happened, the post hoc exposition that we get from Dumbledore as he is explaining what we just saw, and of course the exposition itself from Barty Crouch in the moments after the reveal, including him in this scene. Well, it does make a mess of his timeline. It does kind of confuse his motivation somewhat, but because we are just so much less interested in the details of Barty Crouch's life in the context of the movie, that doesn't draw too much attention to itself. We are able to sense him as a presence and recognize him as an actor, David Tennant, giving a controversial performance, actually. David Tennant's performance in this movie is not generally, and I don't want to go out on a limb here or speak too freely, but I don't think that David Tennant's performance here is generally very well regarded. I don't think that it is enjoyed by most Harry Potter fans in particular, but also just by most people who saw the movie. I don't hate it. Like, I do understand the criticism. I do think it is flamboyant. I do think that it is excessive, but I don't think that it completely breaks our understanding of what cinematic Harry Potter looks and feels like. It doesn't sit comfortably with the book. I think that's pretty fair to say, but so many of the performances in this movie and in the preceding movies too kind of break the limits that are imposed upon these characters, the naturalistic limits which are imposed upon these characters in the frame of the book, that it doesn't bother me too much. We'll talk a little more about David Tennant and about Barty Crouch Jr., of course, when we get to the reveal at the end. So we cut from there straight to the Burrow. This is going to be breathless, you guys. This is going to be a race through the high points of the opening movement of the story, because we cut directly to the Burrow, where we get a radically abridged version of the beginning of this story. We get no Dursleys, we get no Privet Drive, we get inexcusably and unforgivably no Molly Weasley. You want to talk about the unforgivable, Mad-Eye Moody? Yeah, sure, there are some curses you can throw around. Cutting Molly Weasley from your movie? That is borderline unforgivable for sure. We do get our introduction to Amos and Cedric Diggory, the latter of whom is climbing a tree. As you do. 2 beats in this movie of a character just weirdly climbing a tree. We get Cedric Diggory right here at the beginning, and then we get Draco Malfoy later in the courtyard at Hogwarts. And I'm unsure why either one of these young men is climbing a tree. Neither one of them strikes me as a tree climbing sort, if that makes sense. You know, I generally think of tree climbing kids as being a little more, well, a little younger, for one thing, and a little more explicitly outdoorsy. I suppose Cedric is more likely to climb a tree than Draco Malfoy is, but neither one of them works for me. We cut straight to the Portkey Boot, which is a gorgeous introduction to just how special this film is in terms of its cinematography. This is, hands down, for me, the best looking Harry Potter film that we've had to date, and will stand very comfortably alongside the most impressively cinematic moments that we get in the entire saga. There are shots and sequences in this movie which are just gorgeous, and this is why you hire a director like Mike Newell, right? This is why you turn to a director who is very well practiced in relatively gentle and genteel character pieces. If you haven't delved into Mike Newell's discography, you should definitely go back and check it out. I mean, pretty much everyone in the world has seen Four Weddings and a Funeral, I suppose, so that's a good point of comparison. But also definitely go and check out Enchanted April, his adaptation of that book, which is just lovely. It is just a splendid piece of adaptation. I can't recommend that highly enough. The cinematography throughout Goblet of Fire is really quite beautiful, and that is augmented, generally speaking, with a few exceptions, that is augmented by ambitious and very well-crafted special effects sequences. For context, Philosopher's Stone had a budget of $125 million, Chamber had a budget of $100 million, Azkaban had $130 million, and Goblet has $150 million. So 50% more than Chamber of Secrets and a $20 million increase over Azkaban. And it looks it. This is, for me, quite categorically the most visually impressive Harry Potter film that we have seen to date. Joseph is also crediting Mike Newell with anything with Hugh Grant. Yes, he has a stable of actors with whom he likes to work. That is clear. Marshall saying, having this play in the background reminds me of how quickly the plot moves along. I started simultaneously with the Crowdcast and now we're already at the Death Eaters at the Cup. It is so fast. And Lily is asking, why did Chamber get a budget reduction? Chamber didn't need the same kind of budget as Philosopher's Stone because they were able to reuse many of the sets and costumes, and they already had special effects designs. There's a great investment in the first movie in a franchise. So when we say that the budget fell from Philosopher's Stone to Chamber of Secrets, had Philosopher's Stone been a continuing part of an ongoing franchise, it would have had a lower budget. That $100 million for Chamber actually went further than the $125 million for Philosopher's Stone. It went further because so much of that material was pre-existing in terms of design, in terms of actual physical sets, in terms of actual physical props, in terms of costumes and costume design. All of that stuff has already been taken care of by the first movie, particularly when your first and second movies in a series like Philosopher's Stone and Chamber of Secrets are so aesthetically unified. Those two movies feel alike in a way that no other movies in the Harry Potter series well, Deathly Hallows 1 and 2 are going to feel pretty alike, it turns out. But with that sole and solitary exception, none of the other movies in the series are going to feel quite as closely and intimately connected as Philosopher's Stone and Chamber. So really, it's the case that the budget for Chamber went further than we might have expected it to. But $150 million for Goblet, which, as I said, took in a gross of almost $900 million, that is a riotous success. And this is well past the point, of course, at which we are assured of getting every single Harry Potter movie committed to film. Yeah, Marshall is saying, speaking of, I really like it scrolled just at the worst possible moment there. Marshall says, speaking of, I really like the visual design of the Death Eaters at the Cup. The tall hats are obvious clan references and grounds them in real life terrorism. I completely agree, Marshall. I am powerfully struck by that. I am arguably more struck by the appearance of the Death Eaters at the Quidditch World Cup than I am in the graveyard at Little Hangleton much later in the movie, because it feels so violently intrusive. It feels as though these Death Eaters are appearing in a context that empowers them really quite beautifully. It is a brooding and malicious piece of character design, which I really enjoy. It is a shame that we don't get more of it, honestly, but that's true of pretty much the first 20 minutes of this film. It is, as we've said, and as Marshall has already observed, completely breathless. Yeah. Moody never says, constant vigilance. Shame on you, movie, says Angela. I know, of all the lines that you could cut, constant vigilance really needs to be in this movie. But you know what? We do the best that we can. We get to the TARDIS-like tent at the Quidditch World Cup without a wasted moment. We get one of my favorite new lines in the entire piece. Most of the script is taken from the book, of course, as you would expect. Most of the attributed dialogue, we are leaning heavily upon J.K. Rowling's skill with attributed dialogue because most of it is taken and modified very slightly from the pages of the novel. Some of it is recontextualized from one character to another. We get the line about making your hair curl, for example, being pretty comprehensively repurposed in the frame of the film. But occasionally we get these new lines of dialogue which work beautifully as Harry walks into the tent and he beholds its TARDIS-like interior, and we get this great panning shot, and we get the great interactions between Fred and George and Arthur, and it's all very familial and very cozy and very comfortable and very, very lovely indeed. We get this cut of Harry where he just looks stunned and awestruck and says, "I love magic." And that's a wonderful thing because Harry Potter should love magic. Harry Potter should, at least in his heart of hearts, love his experience at Hogwarts. This is always what he has wanted. And I'm thinking in particular, of course, of the characterization that we get of Harry in Goblet of Fire, where, as we observed, he is already pretty done with the whole Hogwarts experience before he even returns to school after the summer holidays here preceding his 4th year. I am much less charmed by, much less convinced by, honestly. It's not just a matter of personal preference as it is a matter of narrative compulsion. I am much less convinced by Harry's somewhat jaded, overly familiar attitude toward the wizarding world. And I completely get the narrative purpose behind that, as we've discussed at great length. The wizarding world is darker now. That is partly a consequence of the world itself becoming darker and Harry's burgeoning adolescence, his sense of his place in the world and his sense of the compromise and corruption which we too often see in real life, in Harry's real life here. I love, though, the innocence and the wonder and the awe with which Daniel Radcliffe says, "I love magic." We then get that gorgeous panning shot of the Quidditch World Cup stadium. We get our breathless reintroduction to Draco and Lucius Malfoy. Not maybe the strongest beat in the entire movie, but, you know, say what you like about Jason Isaacs. The man commits. The man will just pour himself into that role, and he will say whatever is on the script in front of him, even if what's on the script in front of him isn't necessarily terribly good. We get the introduction of Victor Crumb, seeker for the Bulgarian World Cup Quidditch team, and that is it. Hope you enjoyed the Quidditch World Cup, everyone, which is pretty damn abbreviated in the book, honestly, as we mentioned at the time, back in our first discussion, maybe our second discussion of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. It passes very, very quickly, and we do not spend as much time there as we might expect to, but we spend no time there at all in the movie, which is bewildering. It is all but completely excised, right? We get the introduction of the Irish team and the Dancing Leprechaun. We get the introduction of the Bulgarian team and of Victor specifically, and that's it. Hard cut back out to the tent. Turns out the Bulgarians won, and that's all that we get. Instead, we cut ahead to the Death Eaters rampaging through the camp, the appearance of the Dark Mark. I have now officially spent more time discussing this than they spent filming this. I'm probably not filming this, but telling this story on screen. We get the beat of Barty Crouch Jr. casting the Dark Mark. We don't get all of that confusion with Winky and Harry's wand and all of the conspiracy theories which spin out from that moment right at the beginning of the novel version of Goblet of Fire. 13 and a half minutes pass, and we are out of the prologue, and we are on board the Hogwarts Express. It is bewildering. And this is where the movie betrays its fascination with the fine detail and not the topography of the source material. Because like Philosopher's Stone and Chamber of Secrets before it, Goblet of Fire is all but incomprehensible unless you have a working knowledge of the novel. Incidental details are lifted wholesale from the novel and preserved perfectly, mostly perfectly, in the frame of the movie, but they are presented without proper context and proper framing, and oftentimes presented without a real kind of narrative unity. There are so many scenes in this movie which end before the scene has actually run its course, before the scene has actually come to a satisfying point of resolution. We'll just cut away and move on to the next thing because we have observed the narrative nicety, I suppose, of this sequence. We have communicated the necessary detail to the Harry Potter fans and the audience without worrying about the overall shape of the story. This is where Goblet of Fire deviates from Prisoner of Azkaban and returns to exactly the mode and pattern established by Philosopher's Stone and Chamber of Secrets. Whole subplots are abandoned with only the most perfunctory beat associated with them. You know, we will nod toward a couple of subplots. Rita Skeeter is a prime example. Hagrid and Madame Maxime is another prime example. We will nod toward the existence of those subplots so that fans of the book can feel that they got the whole experience, but many more will be cut out. I defy you to get anything but the most superficial gloss of the story just from watching the movie, and that is largely due to the wholesale excisions. We mentioned Molly already, but I have a list here. Sirius Black is almost entirely cut. Ludo Bagman is gone. Winky, Dobby, and the whole SPEW storyline are dropped. There isn't a blast-ended Scroot to be found. Rita Skeeter, as I mentioned, gets a fragment of her plot from the book. The plans for Fred and George to open the joke shop. In fact, apart from that weird and disjointed and fleeting beat on the Hogwarts Express where Ron worries about having enough money to buy all the sweets that he wants, we basically dispense with the notion of well, primarily economic disparity, but disparity of any kind in the wizarding world. For a movie that witnesses the return of Voldemort to the wizarding world, we pay almost, not none, but almost no attention to the notion of pureblood wizards and of that internal tension within the wizarding community, which we've discussed so often here on Dear Mr. Potter. We get no divination classes. We get no Sybil Trelawney. We get no prophetic dreams. We get no Percy. We get no Bill. We get no Charlie. We get no Sphinx. We get no Acromantula. The list goes on and on and on. For a movie that runs almost 2 3/4 hours, if you include the genuinely epic closing credit sequence, we leave a lot on the cutting room floor. There's more cut out of Goblet of Fire, I would argue, than makes it into the final finished movie. Not just in terms of detail. Yes, if you go weight by weight, word by word, page by page, beat by beat through the novel and compare it very closely to what we see on screen, yes, probably most of it is there. Maybe 60% of it is there. But in terms of the fine detail, in terms of the characterization and certainly the character interactions, the character relationships, and more importantly, for me personally, the detail of the wizarding world, all but all of it is cut and left aside. That is not, by the way, necessarily a bad thing. Cuts are not inherently a bad thing. I am not going to sit here and tell you that I am outraged because Hermione's dress is the wrong color, or because Charlie Weasley doesn't show up, or any one of 1,000 editorial and adaptive choices are being made. I don't need a slavish representation of the book in order to enjoy the movie. But if we contrast this with Prisoner of Azkaban, where Prisoner of Azkaban cut, it pared away extraneous detail to focus on the core plot. And Goblet of Fire doesn't. Goblet of Fire preserves the extraneous detail at the cost of the core plot in exactly the same way, I would argue, as Philosopher's Stone and Chamber of Secrets did before it. And that's an even greater than usual challenge. That's a bigger than usual problem for Goblet of Fire, specifically because compared to Philosopher's Stone, compared to Chamber of Secrets, the core plot of Goblet of Fire is pretty damn thin. It is pretty flimsy. Most of the charm of the novel, as we've discussed over the last 20 weeks, however long we've spent discussing Goblet of Fire, most of the charm of the novel comes from that extraneous detail. It comes from those moments of interactions. It comes from the expansion of the scope of Harry's world in the broadest possible, fictional secondary creation kind of sense, and also Harry's experience of that world. Much of what delights us about the Goblet of Fire book, still hardly anyone's favorite book, but still it's still an enjoyable romp, an enjoyable adventure that does some ambitious and thematically crunchy and interesting things. But most of what is of value in the Goblet of Fire novel comes from that extra world building. It comes from the extra perspective and insight that we get on that world building, particularly when you're reading as closely and as analytically as we do here in the context of Dear Mr. Potter. So what we're left with in the context of Goblet of Fire feels like a collection of details without a core narrative to string them together. More on that as we move forward. Dry Heaving Llamas is calling out here, anticipating something that I'm definitely going to complain about later. Dry Heaving Llama says, Fleur's job in the movie was to sit there and look pretty. Unfortunately, that was sort of her job in the book too, but it was much more egregious in the movie. You're completely right. And I think that this is one of the moments, or one of the instances, where paring away the depth and the breadth of the book to the necessary plot points, to the necessary details, and preserving those details leaves us with a wildly skewed and inaccurate depiction of a character. Fleur really suffers in this movie, you guys. She really does. We'll talk a little more about that as we move forward. But yeah, I am always mindful of her absence and just relentless damseling in the course of this. Yeah. It's and as Lily points out, that's without ever introducing the Vila, right? We don't introduce the Vila at the Quidditch World Cup. We don't ever acknowledge the fact that Fleur is part Vila. We don't talk about the possible enchantments that Vila can weave around the menfolk of Hogwarts. But we do definitely preserve the beat where Ron asks Fleur out to the Yule Ball, and that just comes off as even more weird and asymmetrical, I suppose. It is weirdly lopsided because we haven't talked at all about the possibility of enchantment. So in the context of the movie, it is just Ron asking out a girl and being horribly traumatized by it. And there is nothing about Fleur in the film that gives us additional insight into what Ron is going through there. Again, it's just very, very it's simultaneously incredibly assertive, but also very wish-washy, right? It's very clear on what it wants to tell us and didactic about what it wants to tell us in terms of those individual details and individual beats, but doesn't give us the necessary context for us to draw the proper connections and the proper inferences. Nikki said, I'm just scrolling back here. Yes, Nikki said, I've heard that the movie is very confusing from people who have never read the books. There are a lot of plot gaps, holes, and scenes relying on prior knowledge of the story. Beautifully put, Nikki. Completely right. We'll talk about one specific example of that. There are a couple of examples as we'll move through the movie of scenes just not really hanging together, of subplots being dropped or shuffled aside or just being forgotten about. The whole Rita Skeeter subplot never goes anywhere. Her inclusion is more perfunctory than most, I would argue, despite the charm that Miranda Richardson brings. Well, charm may not be quite the right word, but despite the energy that Miranda Richardson brings to the role of Rita Skeeter, that subplot goes nowhere. You could cut her entirely from the story and it would be exactly the same story. We don't leverage that for any kind of dramatic effect. It doesn't move the plot, well, minimally, but it moves the plot hardly at all, and certainly not in a way that would be missed if she were absent from the story as a whole. And we certainly don't do anything thematic with Rita Skeeter and her gutter tabloid journalism. More on that, I suppose, as we move forward, yeah. So we cut from there to the arrival at Hogwarts and the immediate, simultaneous arrival of the Beauxbatons and Durmstrang delegations, where the subtext of the novel, the thematic framework of the novel, is made heavy-handed and stultifying text in the frame of the movie. Beauxbatons is the girls' school. Durmstrang is the boys' school. This is not great adaptation because it misunderstands and ultimately, in effect, misrepresents one of the thematic points being made in the book. Because both Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, in the context of the novel, are co-ed schools, we get differing perspectives on stereotypical and somewhat cliched femininity and stereotypical and somewhat cliched masculinity, with Hogwarts, a co-ed school, managing to work as something of a mediating point between the two extremes by making Beauxbatons the girls' school and still indulging in all of that somewhat arch kind of French Renaissance romanticism, right? That's all still there, but now it's just girls. And we're also dealing with this Slavic austerity and this kind of, what is it that Dumbledore says? The sons from the north, which makes no sense. I mean, Dumbledore presumably knows where Bulgaria is. And that's not to say, of course, that Durmstrang is set in Bulgaria. I'm looking for a more appropriate word. Is rooted in Bulgaria. It does seem to be from somewhere further north in Central Europe, but it still feels like a weird bit of specificity that misses the point quite profoundly and introduces, as if that weren't bad enough, also introduces some additional problems in terms of gender representation. It is one thing for there to be 3 co-ed schools present for the Triwizard Tournament and for 2 of the champions to be boys and 1 of the champions to be a girl, right? That is not, it's a little disappointing, but it is not statistically, statistically problematic or even statistically conspicuous. That is within the margin of error that we might expect here. But by making Beauxbatons the girls' school and having all the other champions be boys, and of course I'm saying 3 champions because I'm not including Harry, whose circumstances are distinct and unique in this instance. By having 3 champions be selected, the boy from the boys' school, the girl from the girls' school, and the boy from the co-ed school, it feels as though Fleur's appointment as a champion of the Triwizard Tournament is more obligatory than I think is implied in the book. She is, well, we're never quite sure how the Goblet of Fire makes its choice, but make its choice it does. She is arguably at least the best prospect. She is the best potential champion from Beauxbatons, or at least the luckiest potential champion, if you want to assume that this is way more, egalitarian and open to social mobility than we might have reason to expect in the wizarding world. Fleur is chosen from a co-ed pool, which makes her gender simply less important and less significant in terms of her being selected as a champion. That is complicated somewhat if Beauxbatons is just the girls' school. I also don't love Michael Gambon's description of them as the lovely ladies of Beauxbatons, or the slight and facile French romantic femininity of their entrance dance, I suppose, this little glee club production that they put on when they come in. The introduction of the Durmstrang boys, I think, works a little better. A little better, slightly better, if only because it isn't so explicitly gendered, I suppose. But the introductions do the bare minimum necessary to get us into the plot, to introduce Madame Maxime, who will be largely irrelevant in the proceedings, Karkaroff, likewise, and the brilliant, the fantastic Alistair Mad Eye Moody, played with a rampaging, take no prisoners kind of enthusiasm by Brendan Gleeson. Gleeson is, I think, just magnificent. I think he is utterly compelling. I find it very difficult to pay attention to anything else that is happening in a scene. As I said, I have watched this movie 4 times in the last 10 days, having seen it a half dozen times before that. I have watched this movie 4 times in the last 10 days, and I am still mesmerized by Gleeson's performance as Mad Eye Moody throughout. What do you guys make of his performance? I'm aware, I suppose, I don't think I've ever seen anyone hate his performance, but I am aware that it is a provocative performance, and certainly we were talking about David Tennant kind of stressing the frame of what we might expect from a Harry Potter performance. What do you guys make of that? Marshall saying that he loves Gleeson, Dry Heaving Llamas saying the same. Let me see here. Oh, Aliceman is saying, I love Brendan Gleeson. Normally, can't stand him in this, honestly. Ha-ha! Aliceman, you are, as ever, an outlier here, dear Mr. Potter. That's fantastic. Can you expand upon that? Can you pull that in? Oh, Mail is saying, minus the tongue thing. I like it. Yeah, which I totally get. Yeah, yeah. Spatula McGrady saying, the Goblet chose from the schools like Michael Bay casts his movies. Give me the gruffest guy. Give me the blondest girl. Yes, I want there to be something to that. I'm going to just part the curtain for you guys here and confess that I spent a good, I want to say half hour earlier today, just kind of pacing around here in the studio, trying to figure out if there was something to that assertion, if the movie is doing something intentional in its reframing of the selection of the champions for the Triwizard Tournament by having the Goblet of Fire select the Durmstrangest Durmstrang boy and the Beauxbatonist Beauxbaton girl. And if we are doing something consciously archetypal in that space, and then I think of Cedric Diggory and I think, we're probably not, right? Because there's almost no sense. While Cedric Diggory is heroic and generous and brilliant and all of those wonderful virtues that we associate with him, I'm going to talk a little more about him in just a moment. He is not at any point in the context of the movie connected with Hogwarts. We even dial back the opposition within the other houses to Harry, right? You'll remember that in the book, pretty much everyone turns against Harry, including the other Gryffindors. Even the other Gryffindor kids are upset that Harry has apparently circumvented Dumbledore's age line and put his name into the Goblet of Fire. That is absolutely dialed back in the movie. There is a certain amount of opposition. We get the Potter Stinks badges, of course, but we don't really get the sense that Harry is an exile in quite the way that he is in the book, which makes the brief alienation between Harry and Ron all the more inconsequential, I suppose. Yeah. Let me see here as I catch up. The Frenchiest fry, says the Norix. Yes. Marshall says, Brendan Gleeson isn't my casting choice, but I like what he does with the part. Mostly I think it's his his physicality is different from the Moody in my head. That's very fair. I could see that. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Okay. Jackie's saying Cedric is the most Hufflepuffly Hufflepuff. He absolutely is, right? I would expect there to be, if we are making a point about these archetypal representations, if we're making a point about the Durmstrang and the Beauxbaton and the Hogwarts, I would expect Cedric to be aligned more closely with what Hogwarts represents. And it is possible, if I'm going to be completely charitable, I suppose it is possible that the movie was intending to do that and just didn't. It is possible that the movie fumbled that, but I would have expected something that would make it clear that Cedric isn't just the Hufflepuff champion, but is the Hogwarts champion in general. It's an interesting thematic space that is opened up by the decision to make both Durmstrang and Beauxbaton single-gender schools. Like you can lean toward that thematic idea, but I'm not at all convinced that anything is done with it, or that anything of value and worth is done with it. Yeah, good. Becca asking, couldn't we have had a quad wizard tournament and have the most houseiest of each house play each other? I mean, arguably, I suppose that's what Quidditch is, right? I mean, we've talked before about the role of the exceptional hero, the role of the seeker in Quidditch being the effective consequence of that, particularly in the Quidditch matches that we have seen so far. No Quidditch matches in Goblet of Fire, of course. Just all Quidditch is suspended at Hogwarts for the entire school year because of the Triwizard Tournament, I suppose. But in previous Quidditch matches, we have seen that yes, the Quidditch teams seem to best represent the virtues and values of their houses. We get kind of good rough and tumble sportsmanship from Hufflepuff, and we get solid tactics and strategy from Ravenclaw. We get, of course, ambitious and kind of a sense of merciless, ruthless ambition from Slytherin, and we just get courage from Gryffindor, of course. There is a sense, I think, in which the exemplary, exceptional heroes of the Quidditch team, the Seekers themselves, do kind of lean into that notion, Becca. But yeah, no, that's an interesting point of comparison, yeah. C-Star saying, Beauxbatons was annoying but believable given the pronunciation of French words by my British professors and the English-speaking inhabitants of certain previously French-owned localities. Yeah, I just couldn't do it. I just can't. Beauxbatons. Yes, I just can't do it, you guys. Beauxbaton is so beautiful. It's so lovely that, yeah. Anyway, let's keep moving on. I should pause actually to account for one interesting bit of cutting that takes place in this movie, or a kind of preemptive cutting that takes place in this movie, because of course, Brendan Gleeson is the father of the very charming Donald Gleeson, who plays, among other things, General Armitage Hux in Star Wars, and Bill Weasley in the Harry Potter movies, possibly explaining his absence from this film. If you guys have never seen Donald Gleeson being interviewed, I urge you to go YouTube some interviews with him, because he is just incredibly charming. He is an incredibly lovely man, and I am increasingly taken with him as a performer. He's an effortlessly mercurial actor, I think. I find his performances most often far more subtle than they have any need to be. I have, of course, mostly been thinking about good old General Huggs, right? I've been thinking a lot about his performances in both The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi of late, in the context of the Story in Star Wars podcast, available now from iTunes or wherever fine podcasts are sold. I've been thinking a lot about Donald Gleeson and just really enjoying his work of late. And of course, yes, the son of Brendan Gleeson. Okay. The Triwizard Tournament is announced. Thank goodness I have some slides in just a moment just to break up the visual monotony for you here. I do apologize. The Triwizard Tournament is announced, which causes shock and outrage from a bunch of kids who literally 5 minutes ago had never heard of the Triwizard Tournament, but that's fine. We get our reveal of the Goblet of Fire itself. Dumbledore explains the mechanics of selection. We cut to some ominous and completely unnecessary scheming from Karkaroff. Then into one of the high points of the movie for me, our first Defense Against the Dark Arts class, our only Defense Against the Dark Arts class, basically our only class of any kind in the span of this movie, because education not a priority at Hogwarts during the year of the Triwizard Tournament. This is where we introduce the 3 Unforgivable Curses. It is broadly taken from the book. It is just a beautiful piece of work. This is one of the longer, may even be the longest non-action sequence in the movie in terms of a single set, single scene, primarily focused on conversation. Obviously some very flamboyant special effects occupying the bulk of the sequence, but it is a non-action sequence that lasts more than 30 seconds, which makes it surprising in the context of this movie, and that may well be why it is so effective. Plus the turns from comedy to horror, to something approaching horror, are handled gorgeously. We might pedantically question how it is that Moody can so effortlessly levitate objects around with nary a Wingardium Leviosa in sight, but, we're just expanding our understanding of how magic works in the wizarding world. From there, we set up Neville's knowledge of the gillyweed for later, so that in the absence of Dobby, Sir not appearing in this film, Harry can still compete in the second task. We cut back to the Goblet, where the prospective champions are entering their names, including Fred and George, who are, weirdly, by every sign and signal given to us in this movie, by the way, Fred and George are now in the same year as Harry, Ron, and Hermione. They just hang out with Harry, Ron, and Hermione all the time. There is almost no sense that they are significantly older. Hermione pedantically points out that aging potions are not going to get them access to the cup, and now is as good a time as any, I suppose, to talk about Hermione Granger and how much Hermione Granger suffers in this film. We've talked about the ways in which we've cut back the story to its bare bones. We're including these incidental details that nod towards significant subplots. And we have Hermione there, more often than not, to stitch those scenes together and to do kind of what she does in the book, to be the slightly insufferable know-it-all. But Hermione suffers more than most from having her character development and character arc cut back to basically nothing. There are a couple of moments later, particularly at the Yule Ball, where I think Hermione shines, where I think she's incredibly charming. But for most of this movie, she is just there to be pedantic and to be insufferable. And I know from some discussions that have taken place via email and over on social media that there are a few viewers of the Harry Potter series for whom Hermione's character is irrevocably broken by this movie. That they like Hermione in movies 1, 2, and 3 and do not like her from Goblet onwards because she is just so one note. And because, honestly, Emma Watson is given an incredibly difficult task. She is given dialogue which any human being would struggle to make charming and compelling and subtle and playful. She does a sterling job with it. She does some good work in this movie, some really good work in this movie. And the rest of the work that she does is completely competent. I do not think that she is bad. I know that some people are very critical of her performance in this film, and I'm not really at home to that idea or to that suggestion. But I will absolutely acknowledge that the writing lets Hermione down hard. And it's not even the individual beat by beat writing, though God knows some of the dialogue is very bad. This sequence in particular with Fred and George is not great. But in general, it's the abridgment of the core text that makes Hermione's characterization suffer. We then get immediately, Chrissy saying that she did like Hermione at and after the Yule Ball. Yeah, I really love that. And Marshall saying, is it me or is Hermione's intense bookishness also toned down to make her more palatable to the lowest common denominator? Wow, that's a really interesting thought, Marshall. I'd never thought of it in quite that way. I suppose I can't reject that outright. I can't refute that suggestion outright. I've always seen the softening of Hermione's character to be in step with the softening of Harry's character and Ron's character and Neville's character and Seamus's character and all the other characters that we get in Harry's year at Hogwarts. She is growing up. She is becoming more of a person. So I generally read her softening in that regard. You know, we're going to get a chance to talk about Hermione in just a couple of weeks when we start Order of the Phoenix, and I'm very interested to talk about her in that book too. But yeah, that's really interesting. Rahit says here, the Unforgivable Curse scene is one of the few times in this movie or any of the 5 latter films save DH1. It feels like a movie and not just a surface level transposing of book to film. Sometimes the characters don't feel three-dimensional or real. They feel like vehicles to read book lines out loud. Rahit, that is beautifully put. I completely agree. And I really do think that there's a structural significance to the Defense Against the Dark Arts class scene. I think that because it is longer than many of the other scenes that we get in the film, particularly the non-action sequences, as I said, because it is longer, we just give everyone more space. We are giving exposition. Of course, here are the 3 unforgivable curses. We're doing it pretty much exactly as JKR does it in the book, but we're also allowing these characters to act and to react, and most crucially, to modulate their tone between outright comedy to slapstick physical comedy to sudden terror and tragedy and the real weight. And when we get that flash of Avada Kedavra with that very familiar green light now, when we get that flash, it is... Well, I think that we can all readily understand why it is that Neville is feeling so shaken, as he obviously is in the staircase afterward, which is, again, also, I think, a really great sequence. That is a well-constructed and well-orchestrated series of events. We have we get the hard cut into the classroom, then we get the events in the classroom, but then we emerge from the classroom in a very naturalistic way where we're continuing the threads of the story without those jarring hard cuts, which are usually associated in the context of Goblet of Fire as a movie with those stern pieces of abridgment and adaptation. We move immediately then into the selection of champions, Victor, Fleur, Cedric, and Harry himself. And I'm actually going to share a slide. Here we are. We are 45 minutes into tonight's session. Here's your first slide of the evening, folks. I hope that you enjoy it. Here we have Victor, Fleur, and Cedric. All of these actors, I will say, do a rather lovely job. Stanislav Yanevsky gets almost nothing to do. That's Victor, of course. He gets a grand total of 20 words of dialogue. Not 20 lines, 20 words of dialogue in the whole movie. But he is nonetheless expressive and intimidating. And there is something... I'm thinking in particular of the montage sequence that we get right before the Yule Ball, where he is walking along the shore of the lake being followed by the gaggle of girls as our heroes watch him walk by. And there is something self-aware and borderline playful in his physicality through that sequence in particular, which I really enjoy. I also think that he does a great job by the time we get into the third task and comes across as legitimately brooding and impressive in that sequence. Clémence Poésy, I'm not sure how hard you're supposed to hit that S in French, but Clémence Poésy is given slightly more to do in her moment-to-moment interactions. She isn't given much more to do than Victor. Fleur does not get much more to do than Victor, but at least what she is given to do is a little more subtle, is a little more nuanced, is a little more complicated, so she gets the opportunity to, hey, what is it called? Oh, act. She is allowed to act a little bit more than poor Stanislav Yanevsky. Though, as I said earlier, Fleur being consistently damseled by the plot in the worst possible way, worse even than the novel, that weighs on me hard when I watch this film, but I still find this performance and Fleur's characterization in general to be charming and surprisingly unaffected. I am always surprised, particularly by the time that we hit the second task, by her naturalistic charm, I suppose. The fact that I am not conscious of watching a performance, and I'm not talking about Clémence Poésy's performance there. I'm talking about Fleur Delacour's performance there. She is not being arch and artful in the way that I might expect that character to be from the pages of the book. Instead, she is apparently very natural and very organic in that role. We can talk about Robert Pattinson, too, who is earnest and delightful and absolutely lands for me something which is not easy and something which could also come perilously close to breaking the frame of consistent characterization in the Harry Potter universe, because he manages to deliver that G-shucks, boy next door, Hufflepuff hero charm that is absolutely necessary for Cedric Diggory to work, is absolutely necessary for us to care about the resolution of this story, but which does innately, I think, stress a little our understanding of what heroes are like. If we think about Cedric Diggory, and we particularly think about Pattinson's performance here, the closest performance that we have had to this in the Harry Potter canon to date is Kenneth Branagh as Gilderoy Lockhart, right? That is the last time that we saw this easygoing kind of charm. Most of our heroes are much more tortured and much more conflicted, and yet Robert Pattinson manages to sell it beautifully. He manages to communicate the real authenticity of Cedric Diggory without apparent mindfulness or consciousness or self-awareness. It's just, I think he's great. I think he does a really charming job at the heart of this film, and that is a tough gig, because if he doesn't work, if Cedric doesn't work, and I will say, I will kind of asterisk that by saying that I do think there are some moments in the third task where Cedric doesn't work for me, but that is a problem with the third task and the structure of the third task and the tonal choices that are made in that part of the film. When he doesn't work, it is conspicuous, but I don't think that's the fault of the actor as much as it's the fault of the demands that are being placed upon the character there. Let me catch up with the chat so we can celebrate Pattinson here. Chrissy saying, I love Pattinson too, but felt he wasn't given quite enough time to build the character enough. I think that's absolutely true. I think that is I think that is fair. I think that is part of this adaptive problem, right? We cut the story back to its bare bones. We cut every interaction that Harry has with Cedric back to the necessary beats and no more than that. That is most problematic for me right at the end of the maze sequence, right at the end of the third task. I think that, as you'll know if you were with me just a couple of weeks ago when we discussed it, that conversation between Harry and Cedric is one of my favorite things. And then as we transition to the graveyard at Little Hangleton and we get the continuation of that real camaraderie and friendship, that is so important to understanding both of these characters. And all of that is cut. All of that is lost. We're just, well, we're not doing anything particularly special with it, I suppose. Yeah. Rayla Lynn saying, I like Pattinson's performance as Cedric. I guess he enjoyed this role too. I saw a video of him surrounded by teenagers shouting Edward and he ignores them. Someone yells Cedric and he turns and smiles at her. Lol. Isn't that charming? Isn't that charming? You guys, one of these days I'm going to talk about Twilight. One of these fine days I'm going to have the opportunity to talk about Twilight. And yes, I hope you'll all join me on that very special occasion. So since we're talking about performances and since we're talking about the selection of the heroes, of the champions for the Triwizard Tournament, let's talk for just a moment about Michael Gambon, shall we, as Dumbledore? I know that we've kind of had this discussion before, and it is the last thing in the world that I want to do to just beat up on the guy and to beat up on his performance. But it is pretty disastrous. And I will say, for what it's worth, that Gambon's performance as Dumbledore in this movie is a low point for the series. I think he picks up from here on out. I think he gives a better and more Dumbledorian performance in the latter movies in the series, but this is really tough. And we must be clear too that while it is tempting to lay the quality of his performance at his feet and his feet alone, he is still an actor in a big budget franchise tentpole movie who is being directed by a director who knows how to talk to actors. So it is entirely possible that many of the choices that Gambon makes in the course of this film are not his to make. That is to say that they were a product of many conversations with Mike Newell, the director, just to kind of excuse a kind of singular approbation in terms of his performance here. But God, you guys, it's just awful. It's irritable and it's inconsistent and it swings apparently at random, from swift to slow, and from playful to a kind of vengeful energy, which I do not enjoy. I defy anyone to try and pin down a consistent, a transparent, a complete emotional arc for Dumbledore through this movie. There are odd moments which really work for me. When Dumbledore leaves his office in the at the end of the second act and invites Harry to take the licorice snaps, and that's actually quite charming. Like, there's a beat there which is just, it's good. But we have to also acknowledge, if we're going to talk about the good in the performance, we have to talk about the bad in the performance. Let's take a moment to read from Chapter 17 of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, a book with which I trust you are all familiar. Professor Dumbledore was now looking down at Harry, who looked right back at him, trying to discern the expression of the eyes behind those half-moon spectacles. "Did you put your name into the Goblet of Fire, Harry?" he asked calmly. "No," said Harry. He was very aware of everybody watching him closely. Snape made a soft noise of impatient disbelief in the shadows. "Did you ask an older student to put it into the Goblet of Fire for you?" said Professor Dumbledore, ignoring Snape. "No," said Harry vehemently. But of course he is lying," cried Madame Maxime. Snape was now shaking his head, his lip curling. "He could not have crossed the age line," said Professor McGonagall sharply. "I'm sure we are all agreed on that." "Dumbledore must have made a mistake with the line," said Madame Maxime, shrugging. "It is possible, of course," said Dumbledore politely. Calmly is the word, ladies and gentlemen. Let's just share this GIF. This is I was very thrilled to discover today that I can drop animated GIFs into PowerPoint presentations. So if you're watching this live, you are now getting the joy of Michael Gambon as Dumbledore crossing the floor in fury with, "Harry, did you put your name in the Goblet of Fire?" It's so bad. It is so misjudged. It is... Here's the thing. I don't actually care if Michael Gambon reads the books. I don't actually care if he has any knowledge. I'm going to have to close that slide now just because it is going to continue to loop and animate here, and I'm going to be very distracted. Oh, apparently if I click away, it just stops animating, so that's very good. I don't care if Michael Gambon reads the books. I don't care if Michael Gambon has ever heard of a Harry Potter, or has ever heard of J.K. Rowling, or has done any more than read the script. It is entirely possible for a gifted actor to read a script and to understand the story that he is being called upon to communicate through his performance, and to deliver a fantastic performance. The history of cinema, the history of adaptation, is littered with actors giving great performances despite a complete ignorance of the source material. Michael Gambon does not give a bad performance as Dumbledore because he never read the Harry Potter books. That, I do not think, is a direct one-to-one correlation there. He's giving a bad performance in this moment. Okay, let's distinguish this into two ideas. A, he's just not giving a good performance. This is just not a convincing performance from a character who is supposed to be a powerful figure of authority at Hogwarts. He is behaving like, well, like Mad-Eye Moody, or like Snape, or like any one of a dozen interchangeable characters in the context of Harry Potter. It just doesn't work. It doesn't communicate what it clearly seeks to communicate. Much more importantly, though, this is a bad adaptive choice. If we look back at the prose taken from the book, we see Dumbledore acting both as a focal point and a fulcrum, a quiet kind of civilizing opposition to the heightened feelings in the room. He is quiet, and he is composed, and he is courteous, and he is careful. He is consistently careful. He is asking Harry, not out of anger, "Did you do this thing? I demand the truth." And certainly he isn't. You can't see this in the animated GIF that I have here on the screen, but of course, this crossing of the floor with, "Harry, did you put your name in the Goblet of Fire?" is accompanied by him grabbing Harry roughly and throwing him back against the many cups and accoutrements that are contained here in what I guess is the Hogwarts trophy room, their trophy lounge. I'm not entirely sure exactly what this room is, but anyway. The problem here is that making Dumbledore reactive undercuts the presence of everyone else in the room. We are now no longer paying attention to Madame Maxime. We are no longer paying attention to Snape. We are no longer paying attention to Minerva McGonagall. This is a conflict that is now just about Dumbledore and Harry. And that is not the focal point of this conflict in this scene. That is certainly not the focal point of this conflict in the book as a whole. This is going to be compounded because for some reason in the movie version, we're now going to switch to Barty Crouch Sr. intoning in stentorian tones that Harry is locked into the Triwizard Tournament, that this magical contract has now been completed, that he has to compete and we have no choice. And then we are going to deviate from Harry's POV entirely to see the faculty standing around the pensive discussing this situation. And Minerva McGonagall will opine in that moment that they should just remove Harry from the competition. which is clearly an option. If she is saying, well, why don't we just not let him compete? Not letting him compete is clearly an option that is available to them at this time, and they choose to proceed. This is incomprehensible. It's incomprehensible in a way that many of the plot points in the Goblet of Fire movie are incomprehensible because the book has been cut back to barely nothing. It has been cut back to just a raw, bloody, ragged skeleton of the story that we're presented with in the book. But worse, that is compounded here because the performance is so violently misaligned. Had we had a calm and present and courteous Dumbledore, even in this scene, I think it could still have worked, but it doesn't. It is, God, it's disastrous. Is anyone stepping up here in the chat? I urge you all, of course, in this safe and inclusive and loving environment, I urge you to step up and to talk about how much you love this. But I'm not seeing anyone right now. If you have thoughts on this, do please get in touch. You can email me, pointnorthmedia@gmail.com. I would love to hear someone defending, not even necessarily Gambon's performance. Like, I won't necessarily ask you to prove to me that Michael Gambon is giving a good performance in this movie. But if you can defend the choice here to make Dumbledore, I mean, just aggressive, he's just wildly aggressive at this point, then I would be very interested in that. Yeah. Good. Okay. Yes, exactly right. As Hannah says, let's assault a student because I'm angry. Not headmaster material at all in this adaptation. I completely agree. Yeah. Good. Okay, let me, who was that? As it scrolled past so quickly. Spatula McGrady saying, in defense of this interpretation, I'd like to keep in mind how much Dumbledore works to keep Harry safe, and given Harry's predisposition to finding the worst places to be, I can kind of understand why you might think Harry found a way to get his name in the goblet, and he can only be pushed so far with Harry's nonsense if that were the case. I don't like it at all, but that's the closest I can get to accepting it in the movie. Yeah, okay. I'll take that. I mean, we have some precedent there in the Harry Potter books for Harry's role being tested, right? You'll remember back at Prisoner of Azkaban where everyone is saying, well, Sirius Black has escaped from Azkaban and just don't do anything, Harry. Don't touch anything. Don't look, don't. What did I just say? Don't. But of course he does, because we still need a plot for the book to unfold, right? I can read that, Spatula McGrady. I can see there being something there. I still don't get that Dumbledore would necessarily be moved to anger, at least hashtag not my Dumbledore. But yeah, I think that's a valid bit of interpretive analysis. Yes. Good. Okay. Yeah, as Jacob was pointing out, the actor and director work together. It cannot be 100% his fault. Yes, no, I completely agree, right? There's a whole process here. We have the original script as conceived. We have the shooting script that is presented to the actors. Then we have the actor's interpretation of that. Then we have the director's response to that. Then we have the actor's reinterpretation of the directorial instruction that he or she receives. Then we get editing, and we obviously this isn't a product of editing in this particular instance because that shot is still there. But there are film is staggeringly collaborative, you guys. So anytime that we are talking about a single director being responsible for any given choice, or a single cinematographer being responsible for any given choice, certainly any single writer, any single actor, we have to be very careful about that, because it is so intensely and beautifully collaborative. That is also, I suppose, the counterpoint to that is that we shouldn't really necessarily fate any individual director or actor or composer or stunt coordinator or best boy or grip or gaffer for any particular thing that we love about a movie, because when we love movies, we are loving the collaborative output of this shared creative endeavor, I guess. Yeah. I am, running way longer than I thought I would tonight, because you are all being so fascinating and because I'm just talking so much. Luckily, we have covered the bulk of the book. We are at this point, that original quote that I just showed you, by the way, is from chapter 17 of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, which is something like 40% of the way through the novel. We are only 20% of the way through the movie. That's how that works out. We are not going to be aligned until the Yule Ball. We have burned the first 40% of the novel, right? We have just blazed through that so quickly in the first 35 minutes there or thereabouts of the running time of this movie. Now we are going to blast through the second act here in order to get to the Yule Ball, which will take place at the midpoint of both the novel, more or less, and the movie, more or less. So the consequence of all of this as I say, the consequence of Dumbledore's reaction here is much the same as the book. Harry's on the hook for the Triwizard Tournament. The magical contract is binding, etc., etc. But as I say, we get this sequence with McGonagall questioning whether or not Harry does have to take part. We cut to Ron being upset that Harry has entered the Triwizard Tournament, which is one of these beats that is just preserved because it was in the book and actually has no bearing on the movie whatsoever. Separating Harry and Ron in the context of the movie accomplishes precisely nothing. Mostly, well, for two reasons. One, Harry is not in exile in the movie the way that he is in the book. Two, we are going to move through this story so quickly that he and Ron are going to be reconciled before any time has passed at all, basically, right? Almost nothing is going to happen to Harry, with the exception of the first task. I mean, that's an extended action sequence, but almost from the perspective of Harry's narrative, almost no time will pass between he and Ron declaring their enmity for one another and then being reconciled at the end. Though we do get this weird beat, and forgive me for some more provocative than usual language here on Dear Mr. Potter, but Ron does tell Harry to piss off, which is... I don't know. Oddly, in a movie that, you know, is the first PG-13 Harry Potter movie because of the blood and the violence, I suppose, and the threat and the evil and the malice and so on and so forth in the third act, that is the thing that makes the movie feel more self-consciously edgy than anything else that happens in the film. It's so weird for a kid's movie. Then we get Rita Skeeter. We get, as I said, that great energy by Miranda Richardson. A weird and misaligned and uncomfortable energy, but a great and propulsive energy nonetheless. But she basically gets her one scene and is then dropped from the movie. She'll show up later, right before the first task, and that's it. That's a movie wrap for Rita Skeeter. This is pretty much the beginning of the second act of the movie, by the way, now that Harry is locked into the Triwizard Tournament and we're beginning the wind up to the first task. With even less acknowledgement of the passage of time than we get in the novel. This is the point at which we transition into the second act, and then we take care of some business. We get the Owl Mill from Sirius, setting the stage for some exposition, broadly irrelevant exposition, honestly, during the fireplace scene in the common room, which is a gorgeous scene. I love how that scene is lit. I love the fireplace effect for Gary Oldman as Sirius Black in this movie. I think it's fantastic. It is completely inessential, and it's all the more inessential because we don't at any point explain either who Sirius Black is, acknowledging that anyone who's watching this movie already knows what's going to happen, or knows what has happened and knows what is going to happen. And we don't talk about what he's going to do going forward. As far as he's concerned, this is the last of their interaction. He warns Harry about Igor Karkaroff, tells him to keep his friends close, and that's it. He's just off Siriusing around somewhere, presumably. Harry is told by proxy that Hagrid is looking for him. We pick up with the scene in the forest where the dragons are revealed. Harry goes straight to Cedric to tell him what to expect. But again, we've cut back the sequence in the forest, so we don't get every detail of the sequence in the forest, which makes the plot itself feel a little more flimsy. You'll remember that in the book, Harry is taken into the Forbidden Forest by Hagrid and shown the dragons, right? Madame Maxime is there, and also he bumps into Igor Karkaroff. So he knows that both Fleur and Victor are going to be aware of the existence of dragons prior to the first task. So he goes to tell Cedric, out of common decency and a sense of strong sportsmanship, there is no Karkaroff in this sequence in the movie. So it is completely unclear why Harry should choose to go to Cedric, except that he wants to give Cedric an advantage over Victor. He might reasonably expect Madame Maxime's presence in the forest, presence with the dragons, to mean that Fleur will have an advantage. Absolutely, that seems fair. But he is not leveling the playing field in exactly the same way as he is in the novel. This is not, I think, intentional. It's just a consequence of one of these adaptive choices. There is no reason for Karkaroff to be in the forest in the movie, so he's not in the forest in the movie, but we behave as though he is. We behave as though he's still there. We will get to my favorite, by which I mean least favorite, the most demonstrative example of this particular kind of adaptation right at the end of the story. We'll spend just a minute on Priori Incantatum. Yes. Jackie says, Siriusing around sounds like something we should all do from time to time. You know, it's really important from time to time just to take an afternoon to yourself and just Sirius it up, right? You just need to connect with your inner scraggly dog, I suppose, and lounge around. I imagine that's what Sirius Black spends most of his time doing. Draco mocks Harry from the tree, as I mentioned earlier. Don't quite understand why Draco Malfoy is in a tree, but there he is. Moody intervenes, transforming Draco into a ferret, being chastised by McGonagall before taking Harry into his office for some more exposition and advice. And this, much like the Defense Against the Dark Arts sequence earlier in the movie, actually hangs together really nicely. We get direct motivation carrying characters from one scene into the next. Harry shows up at the courtyard intending to tell Cedric about the dragons, which he does. Then he has his run-in with Draco, which is interrupted by Moody. Moody is chastised by McGonagall. Moody takes Harry into his office and talks to him about the first task. All of that is connected. All of that is anchored, of course, in great performances too. I think that this is a very strong part of the movie, but it is strong in large part because it is just given more space. It is just allowed to breathe a little more freely. Also, I'll say at this point too, just to reiterate the point from earlier, the set design throughout this movie is gorgeous. Pretty much every set piece is a knockout. I think the special effects get a lot of attention, of course, and as well they should, because for a movie made in 2005, for a large but relatively modest budget, right? $150 million, excuse me, for Goblet of Fire is a lot of money, but it is not an outlandish amount of money, particularly for the fourth movie in an ongoing franchise. This movie looks great. I think pretty much all of the special effects sequences hold up. The only special effects sequence which throws me out consistently watching the movie here in 2018, 13 years later, I can watch this movie and think, wow, all of the effects look great, except weirdly for Fawkes. When we get to Dumbledore's office later, Fawkes just looks very strange. He looks like an animated phoenix in a way that many of the other animated effects in the movie really hold up, I think. So the champions select their dragons. We get the Rita Skeeter section. We get the money-saving device of having the other champions go off. I'm being a little snide, of course. It's not a money-saving device. It's building the tension for Harry as the other champions go off to face their dragons. And then we get the Hungarian Horntail chase around Hogwarts. It is flashy and it is indulgent and it is impressive. I think it's a good looking sequence. Hogwarts looks amazing. There's a real sense of height and of vertigo and of menace, if not of speed, not a satisfying sense of speed, I think, but certainly height and vertigo. I'm a little sensitive about heights myself. And yeah, that sequence as Harry is clinging on for dear life. Yeah, I get a sense of anxiety there, I suppose. But it misses the point of the intent. Why are we destroying Hogwarts? What purpose is served by the sequence that wouldn't have been served by Harry simply facing the dragon within the bounds of the first task? The answer is spectacle. It is spectacle and spectacle alone. In fact, we might argue that the spectacle of the sequence actually detracts from Harry's accomplishment in the first task, because for much of the sequence, he's not trying to get the egg. He's not trying to accomplish his goal. He's just trying to evade the dragon. He's trying to escape from the dragon. So it's a visual, splashy sequence which challenges our understanding of the world building a little bit. Like, we're just ruining Hogwarts now for no real narrative or dramatic purpose. But the biggest problem is that Harry loops back around to the golden egg, but that is not his goal. He accomplishes that goal almost as a consequence of accomplishing what has become his primary goal, which is evading the dragon. The dragon, by the way, disappears from the narrative at this point. We have no idea what happens to that narrative. This is another one of those sequences where, well, we've reached the point where the book changes scenes, so we should probably change scenes too without worrying about the adaptive choices. That said, I love the shot of Harry picking up the egg and then the transition back into the Gryffindor common room. I think that is cinematic. I think that is eloquent. I think it is a really gorgeous transition there. So we get that transition back. Harry resolves the outstanding plot point with Ron without any real effort. And also, here I am. This is why I run late with these sessions, you guys. You know, this is why I consistently run long in podcasting. They resolve this disagreement, the alienation betwixt Harry and Ron, without any real attention being paid to it, and also without any apparent thought, because Ron comes to Harry and says, "You would never have entered your name if you'd known it was going to be dangerous. You're not that mad," or words to that effect, right? By acknowledging the danger of the Triwizard Tournament, Ron has realized that Harry would never have entered his name into the Goblet of Fire, but for two things. A, when Harry allegedly entered his name into the Goblet of Fire, no one at Hogwarts knew that the Triwizard Tournament was this dangerous. So realizing that it is this dangerous does nothing to change Ron's mind, or should do nothing to change Ron's mind about Harry's choice to enter. And secondly, B, here, lots of other students in the school did choose to enter. even if they knew how dangerous it was. I'm not sure that I follow Ron's logic, but I quite like that I can't follow Ron's logic, because Ron is also at this point offering the incredibly convoluted explanation of how he tried to clue Harry into the dragons in the first place by that message by proxy transfer through Hermione that Hagrid wanted to see Harry, of course, which Harry, actually, I wrote this down because Harry lampshades this beautifully. Where is it? Oh, yes. Yes. Harry acknowledging just how ridiculous this is by saying, who could possibly have figured that out? It's mental. This whole plot, it has to occur in the movie because it occurred in the book, but it does serve no purpose, unfortunately. Speaking of things which serve no purpose, but which are themselves rather charming, I have to say, we move into the whole Yule Ball arc, spending some time learning to dance with McGonagall, then a long time trying to get dates, like a long time trying to get dates. But even here, we have some moments of genuine charm. We get Neville, you guys. We get Neville having the night of his young life on the arm of Ginny Weasley. I love the beat of Neville practicing dancing in the common room, or in the dormitory, actually, is very lovely. I love Neville and Ginny stepping out onto the dance floor at the Yule Ball. And then, of course, Neville returning to Harry after Harry has had his dream, after everything that we have learned about cinematic narrative tells us that we have transitioned into the third act of the story. No, Neville pops up just to say, I'm still here. I just got back. Me. It's so good. It's so good. The way that drags us back into the second act and kind of stresses the structure of the movie to augment Neville's excitement and this wonderful night that this young man has had. I absolutely love that. I think that's very smart cinematic storytelling and incredibly charming. And of course, a moment of genuinely lovely characterization that does not come from the book. This is authentic characterization that is not, strictly speaking, an adaptive choice. This is free creativity being exercised by our screenwriter and our, exactly, as Becca's saying, Neville is a constant delight. Yes, Angela's saying too, I love Neville. I killed Harry Potter. Yeah, Neville's just fantastic throughout this movie. He just does beautifully. Yeah. Okay. We nod to the Hagrid storyline. This is all while we're montaging, of course. We nod to the Hagrid storyline, but without the Rita Skeeter storyline present to apply pressure to that, we are not interested in interrogating that subplot for themes of bigotry and prejudice, very self-consciously and very explicitly the primary themes of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, all but absent from the movie. So instead, it's just a 30-second distraction in which Robbie Coltrane gets to be pretty charming, actually. It's just, and Frances de la Tour, of course, gets to be regal and imperious as Madame Maxime. She's really very, very good. Speaking of lovely scenes, though, it's not just Neville and Ginny, because we also get the scene in the Owlery with Harry and Cho, which, again, is just lovely. It's a little longer. It's not as breathless. It allows our actors to actually act, and it even has a proper ending. I like that sequence very much. I find Cho to be just delightful in this movie, and of course now canonically Scottish, because you'll have to forgive me. I'm afraid that I don't have her name embedded in my mind. That is a terrible thing. Forgive me. I wrote down everyone's names and didn't write down hers. I am terribly sorry. But the actress who plays Cho Chang is utterly charming and has one of my favorite accents in the entire world, actually. That very soft, like it's an accent that is common to the southeast of Scotland. It's particularly common to the district of Christorfin in Edinburgh. It's very gentle. It's very mellifluous. I'm utterly charmed by her, and I think that her interaction with Harry is just lovely and also authentic and also sincere and really quite heartwarming. We then get, of course, we have that beat that we mentioned earlier with Ron asking out Fleur, which without the context of Fleur being part Vila, or even the acknowledgement that Vila exist and have special powers over the males of the species, it just comes off as a little stilted and a little flat and a little weird. The Hermione staircase reveal follows shortly thereafter. The start of the Yule Ball works really quite beautifully, thematically and structurally speaking, as the midpoint of the story. Then we are going to spend the rest of the second act on the second task, then tackle the third task in the third act with the showdown at Little Hangleton, kind of bringing up the rear there. The Hermione reveal is self-consciously cliched. We have seen this reveal, even in 2005, we have seen this reveal 1,000 times. And we play into that archetypal sense of wonder, even though I don't think the reveal is as visually powerful as it could be. I think if we really want to do the to do the "Why, Miss Granger, you're beautiful," pull the pencil out of your hair and it cascades down, like the "she's all that" reveal that we're going to get here. Right? If we really wanted to do that, we could have made Emma Watson look a little less like Emma Watson in the first half of the movie, but obviously we're not terribly interested in doing that, and I think the reveal works emotionally really very well indeed. I do quite like it, and as I said earlier, while Hermione is given a really tough a tough job in the context of this film, I think that Emma Watson, particularly in these moments, gets to be relaxed and charming in a way that she doesn't when she is just parroting those Hermione lines in order to provide the necessary exposition, or more often than not, the necessary resistance to the other characters in the scene, and then move forward. I'm having to pick up the pace here because we are running out of time. We then get the world's worst high school band. This is so misguided. I can't even enter into a discussion about this. I think this is, I like Pulp. I love Radiohead. These are, in case you're unaware, these are the bands which have contributed members to a band which is nominally called Weird Sisters, but I guess there was some copyright infringement regarding that. A Canadian band of the same name filed suit against the production, trying to prevent them from using the name Weird Sisters in the context of the movie. So we don't use that name in the context of the movie. Instead, we just get most of Radiohead and Jarvis Cocker from Pulp just singing the world's worst song, just singing like the first pass. It's 4:55 on a Friday afternoon version of what that song is. It deserves something so much better. It really does. It also stresses my understanding of what the Yule Ball is. This is the event that Minerva McGonagall was describing earlier as now I can't. Does she say well-mannered? I forget the exact line that she has, but she's talking about it as an event possessed of a certain decorum and a certain elegance that is somewhat undercut by this raucous and genuinely terrible music. So we'll skip ahead here. We get the lovely exchanges between Hermione and Harry, and the significantly less lovely exchanges between Hermione and Ron at the end of the Yule Ball. Then we cut ahead, Hermione telling Harry on the bridge out of Hogwarts, telling Harry how important it is that he study for the second task, and the movie demonstrates at this point, right? Hermione emphasizes how important it is that Harry buckle down, that he study, that he commit himself, that he really prove his heroism here. And the movie demonstrates a masterful understanding of what it is that makes Harry special by having Cedric immediately show up and give him the clue. Immediately show up and tell him about the prefect's bathroom and tell him to go and listen to the egg underwater and get the clue. We get the whole sequence in the prefect's bathroom with Moaning Myrtle. The less said about that, probably the better. Yeah, the less said about that, probably the better. It's uncomfortable, you guys, is the thing. It is uncomfortably... I've been trying to pin down exactly what it is that makes me uncomfortable about that scene, and exactly what it is that makes me uncomfortable about a couple of other beats in the movie as a whole. That beat in the previous scene, in fact, when Hermione and Harry are talking about the second task, and Hermione describes Victor as being more physically oriented, or whatever the line is that she has, and then kind of blushes and giggles and turns away. There is a streak of bawdy British seaside pantomime sexuality running through this movie, which I do not love. It's not that I think that's incompatible with Harry Potter, and it's not that I think that, gosh, I'm scandalized by the notion that teenagers could even be thinking of sex and romance. How dare they? That's absurd and outlandish. No, okay. We talked at great length about the prefect's bathroom scene with Harry in the book, and about that conspicuously unexpressed kind of tidal subtext of sexuality in that sequence in the book. I'm perfectly comfortable with that. This is something that is going to be increasingly important to Harry, to Ron, to Hermione as they're growing older. This is part of the adolescent experience, absolutely. But there is something about the tawdry, bawdy way that it is presented in the context of this movie that I do not love. Gosh, I wish I had more time to talk about that. I really don't, actually. Yeah, it's just uncomfortable. Actually, Clambert asking, can Dumbledore fire a ghost? I wish that he could. This is clearly like an HR violation that is happening here, Moaning Myrtle. I'm sorry, look, we've talked to you about it before. We've referred you to the Hogwarts So You Want to Be a Ghost handbook. We've underlined the necessary passages for you. We know that you understand what is expected of you. You just can't do this. You just can't hang out in bathrooms all day. I'm sorry for everything that you've gone through, but I'm afraid we're going to need to find you alternative employment. Yeah. Yeah, no, it is just really, really unpleasant. Yeah. Okay. Let me see here. Gosh, still got so much to do. Hermione tells Harry how important it is that he study for the task. So we get the Cedric reveal. He gets the clue. We then go to the library. We're studying there. We get the scene with Neville leading Harry toward the gillyweed in the absence of Dobby, which is, again, right, if you're going to adapt this movie, that's a really smart bit of adaptation. It makes much more sense for Moody / Barty Crouch Jr.'s original plan to work. You'll remember that in the book, he turns to Dobby because apparently Harry just isn't talking to Neville or looking at the conspicuous books that have been placed in the Gryffindor common room. That works beautifully in the frame of the movie. I think that's a very, very smart bit of adaptation. We then get into the second task. It's a visual tour de force. I think this is absolutely stunning. It was, I believe, at the time, the largest underwater set that had been constructed. So a lot of these sequences are actually shot underwater for real, which is why they look so ungainly and so ethereal and alien. I really like the way that this entire thing is presented. I do not love Fleur being unceremoniously dispatched from the second task, of course. She's just going to be taken out by a mermaid. Fleur's entire contribution to this exchange consists of being dispatched by the mermaid, being dragged down with the bubbles. That's the only shot of her that we get. Then when we cut back up to the surface, we get Dumbledore's voice over a PA with his little wand-augmented voice announcing that Fleur has been removed from the competition, and then she's there to meet Gabrielle at the end, which is actually a great scene. I genuinely love the way that Fleur interacts with Gabrielle at the end, and thereafter interacts with Harry and Ron, of course. But it is too bad that she is being, dispatched and damseled again, just to emphasize how dangerous the second task is. Harry emerges as awarded second place because of his heroism, his moral fortitude. He speaks with Barty Crouch Sr. on the banks of the lake. We get a great scene there with Crouch Sr. and Moody, where there are layers of subtext and subtlety in the performances, which are just lovely to behold. I've watched that scene many, many times over the course of the last few days and just really enjoy it every time. We get that little David Tennant tongue flicker, which I know not everyone likes, but I really like Gleeson pulling it into the performance as Moody. That's a nice little bit of very self-aware, very, very, very connected and attuned performance there. I love how that works. And then the movie is just dashing along. We push into the Forbidden Forest for no good reason. We discover the body of Crouch Sr. We catch up with Dumbledore's office. We get Fudge. We get the version of the pensive scene. And if it isn't clear in the book whether Dumbledore wants Harry to use the pensive, it is way less clear in the movie whether Dumbledore wants Harry to use the pensive, and yet it is pretty necessary. We get that abridged scene where we get Karkaroff's confession, and we get an echo, a hint of Crouch Sr.'s zeal, and we get the outfit which clearly got David Tennant the gig in Jessica Jones. Like that's not a Jessica Jones outfit there. He's looking pretty sharp. And then we get that exaggerated performance, which I mentioned earlier, and which I promised I would circle back around to, but which now, unfortunately, I cannot. We then get more exposition. We get the scene with Snape and Harry, which is pretty irrelevant. We've done enough foreshadowing of the Polyjuice Potion at this point. I would argue Moaning Myrtle is foreshadowing the Polyjuice Potion, which is, again, a smart bit of adaptive writing, but at least we give Alan Rickman something to do in this movie rather than just standing around looking as though he has smelled something bad very recently. It's just, it's a little tough. So then we get into our third task. We're at the 1 hour, 50 minute mark. And the maze itself is just really disappointing, I think. It's kind of visually impressive, but it is visually impressive with regard to its one single trick, I suppose, that collapsing, condensing, ever shifting kind of thing that it does. That works out pretty well. We get Fleur, of course, being dispatched again, which is, for reasons which we have discussed many times, just very, very frustrating. We get the showdown between Cedric and Victor, which works pretty well. I do like Harry interrupting Cedric as he's about to deliver something to Victor. I'm not entirely sure what he's going to do at that point, but he is standing over Victor with an aggressive facial expression, I think it's fair to say. Then we have the mad dash to the cup. We grab the portkey and we transition into the sequence, which redeems, forgives, excuses, elevates the rest of the movie. I think the sequence at Little Hangleton, this is not to say that the rest of the movie is bad. As I've made clear, I hope, over the course of the last hour and a half, there are things which I like a great deal about this film. But the Little Hangleton sequence is Well, this is the thing that has to work. This is the part of the story that has to devastate the audience. It has to be pitch perfect or it is going to be laughable. And for my money, it is pitch perfect. And it is pitch perfect almost entirely due to the brilliance of Ralph Fiennes. I think that he delivers a bravura performance as Lord Voldemort. Of course, we've seen him before. We've had versions of this character before, but this to me is just fantastic. He is eloquent. He is menacing. He brings this great malicious focus, an intentionality as an actor, which I find just brilliant. His delivery of every line is perfect, even when it is theatrical, even when it is burdened by this pantomimical excess. It is still intentional. Of course, I'm feeling that way because of our recent discussions about Voldemort as the most theatrical of all wizards, right? That he is leaning into that greatest wizardly virtue, drama. I can see that being embodied in Ralph Fiennes' performance here, and I love it very much. Yeah, Jackie's saying Fiennes is so incredibly creepy as Voldemort. I think he's fantastic. Marshall agreeing, yes, Fiennes is a gem in this role. Nikki's saying, oh, scary hedges, whatever will we do? Eye roll. That's actually a pretty good encapsulation, Nikki, I'm going to say, of the entire third task. Yeah. Let me see here. Oh, that's interesting. Clambert saying, I like Fiennes and I think he did fine, but I also think he's at times not channeling the most menacing Voldemort. He does, however, kill it in this movie. That's interesting. I do think that he is more... I think I see what you're seeing. I think I see what you're saying there, Clambert. I think that he is not always leaning into that sharp-edged, high-voiced, like... ethereal, this is the Dark Lord version of Voldemort. There is something just so much more energetic and something so much more physical. It's not dissimilar, by the way, from the energy and the physicality that Michael Gambon displays in his performance as Dumbledore in this movie. I'm thinking of his little skip up the step and the speed with which he crosses the room and bringing Minerva McGonagall out onto the dance floor at the Yule Ball. There are moments in his performance, I don't like them for Dumbledore. I don't think that is a good match for Dumbledore, but there are moments in his performance that make me think of Voldemort, and that too inclines me toward this very charitable, theatrical kind of thematic analysis of this text, reminded, of course, that Voldemort and Dumbledore are this opposed pair right at the heart of the Harry Potter story, from the very beginning of the first book all the way through to here, the end of the fourth book, and ever onward. We're not done with that opposition just yet. Yes. Good. Oh, Al's been asking, how do we feel about the dark mark in terms of the tattoo? I actually really like it. I do like the dark mark in terms of the tattoo. I like the touching of the wand to Wormtail's dark mark in particular, and the way that it kind of leeches into life is quite disquieting for me. So yeah, that is a semi-practical effect that I actually really enjoy. Yeah. Rahit saying, I'm far more terrified by book Voldemort than movie Voldemort, but that's just a huge missed opportunity for the films. I can see that. I can definitely see it. He does work for me, but yeah, good. Lily saying Gambon's Dumbledore is almost scary, flipping from those jovial and infuriated extremes. Yes. And Becca saying, I miss the Scroots and the Sphinx. There's so much to miss. And lest we forget, the Boggart, the Dementor right there in the maze. One of my favorite interactions in the whole book that isn't just powerfully thematically loaded, but also demonstrates Harry's capability. That is not a spell that we pull out of nowhere for Harry to be equipped with in the context of the third task. We saw him learn that. We've seen him practice that. This is demonstrating Harry's capability as a wizard, and it's all gone because hedges might move, you guys. Hedges might move. Okay, we are just going to have to wrap up, you guys. Let me see. I do want to. Okay, we'll skip ahead. Okay, I have two more things that I have to do, that I absolutely have to do, that I would feel bad about if we conclude without having done these things. The first is to talk about the performative elephant in the room, I suppose, because I have talked a little about some of the performances at the heart of this movie. And I haven't talked about my favorite. You guys, Daniel Radcliffe is magnificent in this film. I find Daniel Radcliffe to be far more engaging and accessible and expressive and thoughtful and nuanced than he has been in any of the previous movies. I think that he is such a bright point at the very heart of this film that I am inclined to credit him with much of this film's success. Not to say that this film is an unequivocal success, but what works in this movie works at least in part because of Daniel Radcliffe. I think he is charming. I think he is funny. I think he is resolute. I think he is capable of communicating enormous emotional swings that many of the more skilled and experienced actors in the cast would struggle with. I'm particularly thinking, of course, of the escape from the graveyard at Little Hangleton and the return to the third task. And as he bursts back with Cedric's body, and the band strikes up, and everyone is jovial, and there's this spirit of celebration, and Harry is just broken by this. That is such a great moment. It is such a knockout performance. He's also genuinely funny, which is something that I don't always find to be true of Daniel Radcliffe. But okay, let me rephrase that. It's something that I don't always find to be true of Daniel Radcliffe's portrayal of Harry Potter. I don't think that wit is something that we genuinely, that we consistently prize in Harry Potter, or that we consistently value in Harry Potter. I find this to be an enormously witty and careful and thoughtful performance. So for me, Daniel Radcliffe, 2 thumbs up, as good as anyone in the movie. I do have one more slide that I absolutely have to talk to you about, though, because this is the example that I've been foreshadowing all discussion about what happens when you abridge the text back to the bare bones. This is the Priori Incantatem speech, I suppose. Let's take a look at this. This is every word of dialogue from that very brief scene between Harry and Dumbledore. So Harry says, "Professor, when I was in the graveyard, there was a moment when Voldemort's wand and mine sort of connected." And Dumbledore says, "Priori Incantatem. You saw your parents that night, didn't you? They reappeared." Harry nods, and Dumbledore says, "No spell can reawaken the dead, Harry. I trust you know that. Dark and difficult times lay ahead. Soon we must all face the choice between what is right and what is easy. But remember this, you have friends here. You're not alone." To which I am inclined to respond, as a viewer of the movie more than a reader of the book, what? What, though? This is not an explanation of what happened. It is not a moment of meaningful interaction between Harry and Dumbledore. What it is an acknowledgement that if you go read the book, all of this stuff will be explained. Dumbledore has to say the words Priori Incantatem because book readers expect to hear them. He is sketching, God, sketching is too generous a term for it. He is gesturing vaguely toward the existence of a story which most of the viewers of this movie will already know, and which is going to be left completely opaque to people who haven't read the book already. When I was in the graveyard, there was a moment when Voldemort's wand and mine sort of connected. Harry just accounting to Dumbledore, his experience of events. This is what happened. I was there, Voldemort was there, our wands kind of connected. Dumbledore says, Priori Incantatem, with no explanation of what that means. You saw your parents that night, didn't you? They reappeared? Okay, that's fair enough. Harry nods and confirms that that is in fact the case, and Dumbledore just takes a hard left turn. No spell can reawaken the dead, Harry. I trust you know that. Okay, that's thought 1. Dark and difficult times lay ahead. That's thought 2. Soon we must all face the choice between what is right and what is easy. We all have to face the choice between what is right and what is easy? What does that have to do with Priori Incantatem or reawakening the dead or Harry having a vision of his parents? Are you saying that we are tempted to reawaken the dead? Well, no, you can't be saying that because you literally just said no spell can reawaken the dead. Like, you can't be warning Harry off the prospect of communing with his parents or of somehow trying to return them to life as Voldemort himself was just returned to life. You can't be doing that because no spell can reawaken the dead, Harry, was the first line of that block of text. But remember this, you have friends here, you're not alone. Cool. Like, good. I get it. Hey, Dumbledore, thanks for being genuinely supportive and for not, directly physically assaulting a student in your care. That's wonderful. But this is not story. This is a facade, a facsimile of story. It is the hollow shell of story. It is something that represents stories which exist elsewhere, but into which we are not going to delve right now. It's just thin. It's just thin. Yes. Marshall Moore saying, "Oh, I'm never going to pronounce this. Gambondledore. Is that how we're referring to him as distinct from Harrisildor, I suppose? Gambondledore. This is word salad nonsense, and your thoughts aren't connected at all." No, he has just pulled too many thoughts out to put them in the pensive. I think that's the only possible explanation. Yes. Priori Incantatem. You saw your parents that night, didn't you? They reappeared. No spell can reawaken the dead, Harry. I trust you know that. Dark and difficult times lay ahead. Soon we must all face the choice between what is right and what is easy. But remember this: you have friends here. You're not alone. Great. I mentioned earlier that I defy anyone to pin a consistent and cohesive narrative arc, just a character arc for Dumbledore in the course of this film. I defy anyone to pin a consistent and cohesive character arc for Dumbledore in this scene. It's just bewildering. And I'm pulling this out and I'm having a little fun with it, obviously not to denigrate this movie, but rather to point out that this is the problem. All of these times when I've talked about adaptation in the context of Goblet of Fire, in the context of Azkaban, though it's much less a problem there, in the context of Chamber of Secrets and in the context of Philosopher's Stone, every time that we have talked about this, this is what I am talking about. Rather than communicating the actual narrative, we are playing the proper noun game. We are just pulling these references from the original text and representing them on screen without any thought, without any context, without any actual desire to communicate a greater story. And that is a problem. That is a problem. Okay. Let me, rather than cancel this slide, actually push straight on. This is what we're going to do next. You guys have been talking about this over the course of the last few sessions of DMP, and now the plans are laid. Next week, we are going to look at The Worst Witch by Jill Murphy from 1974. This is a very short book for children. This is going to be a pretty short session, but I'm sure that we'll also have some other thoughts on Goblet of Fire with which we might catch up. I think that book is something like 90 pages. It's extremely short, and it is for I forget where you draw the lines here, elementary school readers, possibly even more than middle school readers here in the US. But yeah, it is a very basic book, but it did foreshadow certain tropes and certain conventions that we would recognize in Harry Potter some 20 years later. So next week, June the 26th, an evening session, 10 p.m. Eastern at 9 p.m. Central, we are going to look at The Worst Witch by Jill Murphy. Then the following week, we're going to do this in 2 sessions. On July the 3rd and then again on July the 10th, we are going to look at The Sword in the Stone by T.H. White, published in 1938, the first book in what became the Once and Future King series. This is a very specific and interesting text because this is one of the very few texts that J.K. Rowling has acknowledged as being inspirational to her. She has talked about the Sword in the Stone specifically, and the Once and Future King in general. Excuse me, I'm having some trouble with my words this evening. She's talked about these books as directly influencing her understanding of who Harry Potter as a character is. So we are going to spend 1 week looking at The Worst Witch. Next week, we're going to spend 2 weeks thereafter looking at The Sword in the Stone, and then on July the 17th, we're going to begin our discussion of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. I cannot wait to get into that book. I cannot wait to discuss that with all of you. It is going to just be delightful. And I'm so glad, yes, as Jackie and Nikki are confirming here in the chat, The Worst Witch is adorable. Like, it is a children's book, but it is very, very charming. And I think that you guys will really enjoy reading it if you haven't before. Yeah. Sarah is saying here, as a fan of the series, I've always been somewhat offended by how badly the Goblet of Fire movie was done. I've always felt that they're just trying to get something out there, but not really taking the time to think it through and adapt it well. I am inclined to agree. Unfortunately, I think that it is a hot mess of a movie, is the thing about Goblet of Fire. It is a hot mess of a movie. It is made much worse by some thoughtless cuts, by that erratic adaptation, but it is also elevated by generally brilliant cinematography. I think this movie looks astonishing. Some generally excellent performances. So good, in fact, that they balance out, for me, those performances which are less than impressive. It is nothing like as focused and as purposeful and as assertive as Prisoner of Azkaban. Spoilers to you guys, none of the rest of the movies are going to be as purposeful and polished and assertive as Prisoner of Azkaban. That is going to stand alone in that particular regard in the Harry Potter series. I don't think it possesses that same sense of awe. I don't think that Goblet possesses that same sense of awe and wonder that we associate with Philosopher's Stone. It is simply not as magical for me personally as Philosopher's Stone. I still think that I rank it above Chamber of Secrets. And that is not to say that Chamber of Secrets is a complete disaster of a film. I think that the highs in Goblet of Fire are such that I can enjoy it, but it is not one of my favorite of the Harry Potter series, and is absolutely a missed opportunity, if for no other reason than the fact that the 3-act structure is present right there in the superstructure of the Triwizard Tournament. Yeah. All right, you guys, that is going to do it. Thank you. Gosh, I'm 10 minutes over time. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for sticking with me through my absence last week. I hope you didn't miss me too much. I will talk to you all again next week, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central. That is, oh no, let me glance at my notes so I can confirm the date. June the 26th, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central next week for The Worst Witch by Jill Murphy from 1974. That is going to be a really fun discussion. And back in just a few weeks to talk about the next Harry Potter novel. I will talk to you all again very soon. Until then, take care. Mischief managed. Good night.